The most famous human being in all of history was a first-century Jewish revolutionary. His name was Jesus. Christians believe Jesus was crucified, died, and on the third day rose from the dead and ascended into heaven. But for 2,000 years, there have been those who've challenged the truth of this biblical story. And some have died for expressing those doubts. From Jerusalem to the villages of southern France, from the wildness of distant Kashmir to the exotic Philippines, we shall try to solve this 2,000-year-old mystery. We'll take a journey that asks, did Jesus really die on the cross? The story of Christianity features not only the most famous name in history, but also the most famous event in history, the crucifixion. For some, or even many true believers, the fact that Jesus was crucified, died, rose again, and ascended into heaven can be literal truth. But throughout history, there have always been those, sometimes Christians, who've asked awkward questions. Would a man die after only 6 hours on the cross? Was he drugged? What really happened in the sepulchre? And if Jesus didn't ascend into heaven, then where did he go? For many Christians, these questions risk undermining the whole basis of Christianity and are extremely controversial. The most crucial part of the story, which all Christians are expected to believe, is the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. The resurrection.
The resurrection is actually the primary story at the heart of Christianity, without which you wouldn't have a movement. You could have Christianity without the virgin birth. However, none of them tells it without a resurrection story.
Despite the best efforts of the Church, the resurrection of Jesus and his later ascension into heaven have, for 2,000 years, been fertile ground for heresy. Some people suggest that Jesus was rescued from the crucifixion and escaped to live a secret life in southern France. Some have been convinced that Jesus survived and traveled to the mountain kingdoms of Kashmir, where he lived to the age of 80. With the help of leading historians and theologians, we will examine these most controversial theories. To understand what happened to Jesus after the crucifixion, we need first to look at the facts of his life. But what is historical fact? What is the evidence? Almost all we currently think we know about Jesus comes from the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Matthew and John are the only Gospel writers who were members of the 12 disciples, the only ones who could have been present at the events they describe. The four Gospels were all apparently written between 40 and 100 years after the crucifixion, which Roman history tells us happened around 30 AD. But despite the fact that we know them by those four names, modern biblical scholars cannot be absolutely sure who really wrote them.
Originally, all these Gospels circulated anonymously. There were no names attached to them until almost 200. And the Christian theologian who came up with the idea of having a New Testament was roundly condemned as a heretic.
Whoever did really write the four Gospels, the description of Jesus' death in all of them is brutal. Every year at Easter, Christians in the Philippines reenact the crucifixion of Jesus. They actually volunteer to be crucified. They do it because they believe it will help them to purge their sins. For the onlookers, it's a bloody reminder of what happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago.
Crucifixion was the most cruel and atrocious punishment that the Romans could inflict. And it was inflicted only for treason and only on slaves. If you were a nobleman and you were a traitor, then normally you were strangled, something much simpler and much easier and much less painful. After condemnation, the cross beam, was strapped to the shoulders of the criminal, and he paraded through the streets with his arms stretched out. At the place of execution, then, nails were hammered into the hands and the feet.
In the Philippines, they do use real nails. They do experience the real pain that Jesus felt. But a man nailed to a cross does not die from his wounds. He dies, surprisingly, from suffocation. Hanging by your arms, the chest is compressed. It's hard to breathe without supporting your weight with your legs. Over time, the strain and the pain make that impossible, and you're unable to breathe. In the Philippines, the volunteers are brought down from their crosses within an hour. Death from crucifixion takes much longer, often several days. The only way to hasten death on the cross was to break the legs, making it immediately impossible to support your weight, and therefore to breathe. But the Gospels are all agreed that Jesus died after only 3 to 6 hours. The crucifixion began at the 3rd hour. And it was the 3rd hour, and they crucified him. Some claim that the Gospel according to Luke has the shortest crucifixion. It was about the 6th hour, and when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he gave up the ghost. Matthew and Mark have Jesus surviving a little longer. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out. The disciples wanted to take Jesus' body down from the cross immediately, but the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, wasn't convinced that he was dead. And Pilate marveled if he were already dead. Pilate was reassured by the centurion, but this was the same centurion who had earlier said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Jesus' body was then laid in a tomb, donated by a rich man, Joseph of Arimathea. This Joseph and a man called Nicodemus came to minister to the body. They came to Jesus by night and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds weight. These accounts, when viewed as an historical rather than a sacred record, may raise questions. Why did Jesus die so quickly? Why did Joseph and Nicodemus take so many herbs into the tomb? So it's perhaps not surprising that some people have even dared to ask whether Pilate was right to have his doubts, whether Jesus really did die on the cross. That Jesus might not have died on the cross is an explosive idea, particularly for Christians. In our journey to understand the truth about Jesus' life and death, we need to look further at the biblical accounts of the resurrection. It was here in Jerusalem that Jesus was crucified, and according to the scriptures, rose again from the dead. But in Jerusalem, one is forced to remember that we do not live on a Christian planet. Hundreds of millions of Jews and Muslims may accept that Jesus lived and died in first-century Palestine, but only Christians believe he rose from the dead. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, built upon what was supposed to be the tomb in which Jesus was laid after the crucifixion. This, according to devout Christians, is the exact site of the resurrection. And if anything can be described as the cornerstone of the Christian faith, it is the resurrection.
The resurrection of Jesus, as far as all the Christian churches are concerned, is absolutely fundamental to the faith. There's no question, in my mind, that it's ever going to be changed.
The resurrection may be fundamental to the faith, but in our examination of what really happened, it's hard to find solid historical evidence. The four Gospels all tell different